All right, well, welcome everybody. I am sure we are going to have other people join us as time goes on. I encourage you to have a Bible with you if you want, on your phone, a hard copy. This is not going to shock any of you who know me well. I'm not the most tech savvy guy, but I am going to try to kind of toggle back and forth with the share screen function tonight, as well as the chat function, so that you'll be able to see some of my notes and some of my outlines and diagrams on my screen. Hopefully that will all go smoothly. There's also going to be, and you can see that it just went up on the chat, a Google Doc that you can open as the kind of night is going on that will both have some notes in it, but also the ability to write down questions as the night goes on for the interactive Q&A section towards the end. My goal is to maybe just kind of do some teaching from Psalm 90 for 40, 45 minutes max, and then just take whatever time we have. After that, you're all welcome to take off whenever you need to, but just to use whatever time we have after that for interactive Q&A. And I'll start from whatever questions you kind of record on the Google Doc, just because there are so many of us that actually kind of opening it up to everybody to just interact might be a bit of a chaos. And so we'll try to use the Google Doc tonight. So if you have Psalm 90, I encourage you to open to that. Let me give just a little introduction. I'll pray and we'll get into Psalm 90 tonight. Psalm 90 is, to me, the ultimate kind of response to crisis in not only the Psalms, but perhaps in all of Scripture. And I absolutely know that in this season of COVID-19, that this season is landing on all of us in different ways. And so I don't want to assume that my experience is your experience, or that someone else's experience is your experience. For some people, this season is filled with a lot of disappointment and confusion, perhaps even heartbreak with sickness, perhaps even the loss of loved ones, the loss of jobs. For others, it might be more of an abstract idea so far, apart from having to stay at home. I know that the spectrum and the range of experience that all of us bring to the last couple of months is all over the place and different. But nonetheless, I think this is a season of crisis. And I think Psalm 90, which for many years now has been my favorite psalm for various reasons that I'll get into tonight, I think is an incredible resource for the people of God all the time, but especially in a season like this. My goal is for this to be encouraging, for this to be practical, for it to be helpful. There will be, because it's just there in Psalm 90 and it's real life, there will be some hard emphases tonight that we see in Psalm 90. You have to kind of go through the valley before you get to the sunshine in life as well as in Psalm 90. But my overall goal is not that this would be discouraging, not that you would leave more angsty, more weighted down, but that there would be a real sense of discernment, a real sense of optimism in the deepest sense. By the way, as you join us, you can mute yourself. I can hear some of you in the background right now. Sophia, if you can mute yourself, we can hear you right now. And unfortunately, this is not my Zoom account, and so I'm not the host, and so I can't mute other people, unfortunately. So please do just mute yourself as we go throughout the evening. And then just as we begin and as we look at Psalm 90, I want us to enter into this time with this kind of overall idea. We live in a culture that is marked out by desiring to reduce things to being as simple and easy as possible in general. And one of the themes that we will see throughout tonight in Psalm 90, in this season, and how God works in situations like this, according to Psalm 90, it is an overall insistence that we need to kind of hold on to two things in a both and kind of way, rather than choosing one over the other in an either or kind of way. And so that's not abstract. Let me flesh that out a bit. In 2 Corinthians, which is an incredible letter, although often neglected, from the Apostle Paul, Paul very famously says in 2 Corinthians 6 that we Christians are sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. Not sorrowful instead of rejoicing, not joyful instead of sorrowful, or not even like sorrowful first and then rejoicing afterwards, but at the same time, in a both and kind of way, We are sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. And I think part of what makes seasons like this so difficult, crisis in general, even wrestling with what Psalm 90 presents to us, is that we just want to move on from the hard stuff as quickly as possible and grab the good stuff. And so often we need to hold on to both at the same time to really do justice to reality. And so let me start with kind of 3 overall points that I want us to read and hear and wrestle with Psalm 90 in light of. And then I'll read Psalm 90 out loud. I'll give a little background. I'll make comments about it for a few minutes. And then we'll have time, Lord willing, for some interaction. The first is this, and for some of you, this will be things that you already know, things that you're even thinking about in this season. For others of you, this might be an aha moment. But either way, I think that this is always good to be reminded of. The first is this, that whatever reality is for us as human beings, as Christians, it is neither just our circumstances external to us, kind of objective reality in the world, nor is it merely our subjectivity, our beliefs, our feelings, our perceptions, our responses, but reality is a combination of the circumstances we are in and our response to our circumstances. And we're going to see that in Psalm 90. The first half of Psalm 90 emphasizes what is true of the world we live in, whether we like it or not, whether we're aware of it or not, whether we accept it or not. And the second half of Psalm 90 is filled with a reorientation of responding to that in a new way, in a counterintuitive way, and holding on to this, that reality in our lives is the circumstances around us plus our response to, our experience of, our perception of, and engagement with our circumstances is helpful to stay away from 2 extremes. On the one hand, if all you're aware of is circumstances, you're aware that life is shut down right now, you're aware you just got to stay inside whether you like it or not, you got to work from home, maybe you've lost a job, maybe a loved one has gotten sick or already passed away, and that's dominating your whole horizon. Insofar as circumstances are all we see, all reality is to us, in seasons of crisis, we will always be vulnerable to despair. On the other hand, if, as many people in our culture often try to do, we try to retreat into our inner life and we try to convince ourselves that it doesn't matter what's going on circumstantially, it doesn't matter what the situation of the world is, it doesn't matter whether there's justice and injustice, it doesn't matter what's happening to my body and other people's bodies, it doesn't matter what's happening to the economy and to other people outside of me, it just matters what I'm thinking about, it just matters what my attitude is, then we're going to run into the opposite danger, which is denial. And we will increasingly find ourselves out of whack with the world and even being deeply inauthentic and disingenuous. And so reality is circumstances plus our response to circumstances. Our circumstances are there, they limit what we can do, and they must be dealt with, and they cannot be overcome. But nonetheless, they're not the whole thing. Our response to reality, for some of us, perhaps we'll hear tonight, it actually gives us much more freedom, much more agency, much more dignity than sometimes we think. The second point, and this really just flows out of the first one, is a therefore, is that in seasons of crisis, this is probably true for all human beings, but having been a Christian for 20 years now, my sense is that as Christians, we really struggle with this balance, with the need to be both and here, rather than either or. Whenever a crisis arises in the world, in our lives, in a generation, in history, the proper biblical understanding of it is that it is both a tragedy and an opportunity. For some of you, it's probably hard as the days and the weeks go on to feel like this is anything else but a tragedy, anything else but just a disruption, anything else but just a waste of time, just suffering, just frustration, just angst. And for some of us, the tragic element of this can loom so large that it just defines what the crisis is. But crises are never just tragedies in the history of God's people. They are also at the same time also opportunities. But I would guess that in my experience in the church, For us as Christians, our temptation more often than not is actually the second aspect of being either or rather than both and, which is to immediately overemphasize that it's an opportunity, to immediately go to Romans 8:28 and say, hey, God's going to bring good out of this. And even to almost have, and if this is offensive to anybody, I apologize, but almost like a kind of hyper Calvinist calculus where the reality that God brings good out of evil actually morphs into the evil itself is good because God brings good out of it. And that's not true. God does bring good out of evil. There are new opportunities that arise out of tragedy, but they never mute, they never nullify, they never deny the fact that it is tragic that 60,000 people in this country have died already. It is tragic that lives have been disrupted all over the world. It is evil, it is disastrous, it's catastrophe. And for some of us, what we're really going to have to kind of listen to anew in Psalm 90 is to accept how broken the world is to actually enter in and accept that this is a tragic situation, and yet to hold on to the fact that this is also an opportunity, that God is testing, that there is a sense in which this is a trial in which he's refining his people, moving the world towards its redemption. And again, in a both and kind of way, to respond properly to crisis, we need to be able to name it and respond to it as both tragic and as an opportunity. And for most of us, including me, we would rather it just be a tragedy, or we would rather it just be an opportunity. And the emotional nuance and complexity of being sorrowful and rejoicing at the same time, we're honestly not all that good at that in our culture, and it makes us uncomfortable to be in both places once experientially, and we always want to try to move out of one into the other. Either think that everything is depressing, everything is sad, and there's no real reason for hope and optimism in the moment, or that because God is at work and because he's to be trusted, that there's no real tragedy to be lamented here. Third and final point, that we're going to read Psalm 90, is crises always bring trauma to our lives. And trauma is a broad spectrum, but I actually think that Psalm 90 reminds us, in a season like this, reminds us that if you live long enough in a fallen world is broken enough, painful enough, what Cornelius Plantinga calls the not the way it's supposed to be-ness of the world as it currently exists. If you live long enough in it, and if your eyes are open, everyone is traumatized by this world. Everyone will come out of this season in one way or another with dimensions of trauma that will need to be dealt with. And here's the last both and that I want us to hold on to as we look at Psalm 90. And some of you know this either from your own experience, or perhaps talking to counselors, or perhaps your own reading and study, perhaps even your own profession. And for others, this might be a new category. I have found it to be incredibly helpful and important in my own life, which is to remember that in the short run, our response to crisis, our response to trauma is almost always good, that we kind of buckle down and we have these survival instincts, that we kind of numb ourselves to the overwhelming reality going on around us. We don't feel everything all at once, and we kind of go into survival mode, and we have a lot of instincts of just focusing on what needs to be done, waiting until later to deal with some of the hard stuff. And in the short run, that's not only good, it's necessary. And it's part of, I think, common grace that God has given us, that resiliency as human beings, that when trauma comes, our short-term, instinctual, even non-cognitive, pre-cognitive response is incredibly important for our survival. But here's the danger. The more instinctual and short-term our response to trauma is, and as necessary as it is, the more that becomes the settled, default, de facto way we deal with trauma, namely dimming the light bulbs in our heart and our mind, just kind of going into survival mode, not really processing emotionally and relationally our grief and our confusion, but just kind of staying busy or just focusing on the good things that are there for us, even in these present limitations. The more we stay there in the long run, what was necessary and helpful and even good as a short-term response to trauma actually becomes counterproductive in the long run. And one of the things that most trauma specialists agree with across the board is that no one deals well with trauma instinctually in the long run. everybody's gut instinct is to do some unhelpful things. And especially in the second half of Psalm 90, we're going to see that some directions, some skills, some practices are given to us to deal with the long-term reality of the trauma we experience in crisis seasons like this. And so maybe just a practical way to flesh that out, and then we'll read Psalm 90, is I included in my description for this event a great quote from one of my favorite novelists, Flannery O'Connor, and short story writer as well, and I'll just read it again. She says in her novel Wise Blood, "Where you come from is gone." That is what our past was even 2 or 3 months ago. That world is gone already. "Where you thought you were going in your life in the future, you are never going. It was never there. And where you are now in the present is no good unless you can get away from it." And one of the things I think Flannery O'Connor is pointing out there is that if we just do in the here and now what comes naturally to us, we will invariably go in some wrong, unhealthy directions. And it is very obvious that trauma that is either not dealt with or dealt with wrongly catches up to us in the long run. The body keeps the score, as Bessel van der Kolk says, and just a lot of long-term damage comes into our lives, into our communities, when we don't process and walk through trauma well. And again, I think Psalm 90 is incredibly valuable for how it helps us to name, to process, and ultimately to respond to trauma and crisis. So if you have Psalm 90 open, feel free to open to it. I'm going to try to share on my screen a couple of times tonight. Just a couple of handouts of the text of Psalm 90 and some structure. Let me go ahead and see if I can put that up now. Okay, you should be able to see this. Let's see. Okay, so here's Psalm 90. And let me draw just a couple of things to your attention before I read it out loud. And again, you can be reading this on your own, but hopefully you can also just follow along on the screen. Again, let me know at any point if the video or the audio breaks down. The first thing to notice is that Psalm 90 is described in its superscription as a prayer of Moses, the man of God. Some of you are aware of this, that there are 150 Psalms in the Psalter, or in the book of Psalms. And in those 150 Psalms, they are broken up into 5 books. There's 2 things that are especially important to be aware of with Psalm 90 as we read it. The first thing is that this is the only Psalm out of 150 Psalms that is ascribed to Moses. This is the only Psalm. There's lots of Psalms ascribed to David. There are Psalms ascribed to Asaph and to others, the sons of Korah, but this is the only Psalm in the entire Psalter that is ascribed to Moses, and that is not accidental nor insignificant. We're going to see that it conjures up for us a scenario, a situation in the story of God's people that helps us to both hear what Psalm 90 is saying, well, accurately, but also to find analogies and comparisons in our own crises to what happened here. In fact, in book 4, and this is the second point, that Psalm 90, if you have it open in your Bible, you can probably see right above Psalm 90, it says book 4. This is the first Psalm in book 4. And there are, and if you want to check this out later, feel free, there are only 8 mentions of the name of Moses in the entire Psalter. 7 of the 8 occurrences of the name of Moses show up in book 4, which is also the shortest book of the 5 books in the Psalms. Book 4 starts in Psalm 90, and it ends in Psalm 106. And this is the last thing I'm going to mention as background, and then I'm going to read Psalm 90, which is, if you would back up and read in the days, weeks to come, the Psalms that appear before Psalm 90 in book 3, which starts with Psalm 73 and goes to Psalm 89, it's very clear that book 3, the middle book in the Psalter, is the darkest of the 5 books. It is a book that is filled with crisis. It is a book that is filled with disaster. It's a book that's filled with suffering and with lament. How long, O Lord, becomes one of the great refrains of book 3 of the Psalter. And arguably Psalm 73 and Psalm 88 and 89 at the end, as bookends, are both incredibly traumatized psalms in which disaster has befallen the people of God. And again, for the sake of time, I won't belabor this too much, but it becomes pretty clear when you read book 3 of the Psalter, Psalm 73 to 89, that it's not just crisis in general, it's not just disaster and lament in the abstract, but it's specifically the ultimate crisis and disaster that befell the people of Israel, the people of God, during the Old Covenant, that Psalm 73 to 89, book 3, are wrestling with, namely that in the 6th century, the great, ferocious, cruel Babylonian Empire brought their army into Israel and destroyed the southern kingdom, destroyed Jerusalem, burnt it to the ground, destroyed the temple, and carried the Davidic king and his people off into exile. And so book 3 is wrestling with the crisis of the people of God losing their land, losing their king, and losing their temple. The place of God's blessing, the place of God's presence, and the guarantee that God's authority and protection is over the people and the king. All of that is lost. And when you get to Psalm 90, and this is a really helpful way to think about Psalm 90, Psalm 90 is not the immediate gut instinct response to trauma. Psalm 90 is the response years later. Psalm 90 is the response of someone who's been sitting in crisis for a long time, which, not to, compare our own situation today to how epically disastrous that was, but for all of us right now, our experience, I would imagine we could across the board testify to this, is different right now, 2 months into this, than it was in the first day or the first week when we went into quarantine as a culture and as a country. And some of you might even be in other nations of the world right now tuning into this. That Psalm 90 is someone who has been ruminating in and been saturated with crisis, not for a day, not for an hour, not even for a week, but it's been his reality for a while. And the reason I think this psalm is placed on the lips of Moses is, and I will work down my screen here in a bit, and you'll have access to this later, there are 2 places in the story of Moses earlier in the Old Testament that Psalm 90 alludes to and evokes over and over and over again. The first one is Exodus 32 to 34. And if you want to turn there, you can, but I'll just sum it up for you really quick. Exodus 32 to 34 is the first big crisis in Moses' life, which is he has, in faithfulness to God, brought the people of Israel out of Egypt. They have crossed the Red Sea. Pharaoh's army has been destroyed. They're no longer enslaved. God has miraculously, faithfully provided for the people with manna in the wilderness and water from the rock. And they have come to Mount Sinai, and God has given them his 10 commandments. And in Psalm 32 to 34, this is kind of the disruption or even the kind of side turn that's unexpected in Exodus, which is while Moses is up on the mountain receiving the 10 commandments from God, the people of Israel are turning away from the God who has liberated them and made covenant with them to form a golden calf idolatrously and to worship it, to thank it, to bow down to it. And in Exodus 32 to 34, it's the first great crisis moment in Israel's story where God tells Moses, I am done with this people. I am angry. I am filled with wrath, which, as we'll see here in a second, this is the language that dominates the first half of Psalm 90, that God is angry with us, that God's wrath and judgment are being experienced. And Moses stands up, intercedes with God, and prays something in Exodus 32 to 34, which we're reminded of in Psalm 90, namely that he asked God to turn back, to turn away from his anger, to change his mind, and to have mercy instead of showing judgment. And Moses is able to change God's mind, to turn away God's anger, and instead to bring a season of mercy to continue to be prolonged in the people of God. The other place in Moses' story that Psalm 90 echoes and evokes, and I'll give you some specifics here in a few minutes, is the very end of Moses' life. Deuteronomy 31 to 34. And in the near future, if you want to pursue and even pray more than that, Psalm 90, Exodus 32 to 34 and Deuteronomy 31 to 34, these are great places to kind of have open in your Bible so that you can imagine the backdrop in Psalm 90 more tangibly. And in Deuteronomy 31 to 34, and I'll mention this a few times tonight, I have always found this to be, and in my experience when I teach scripture as a pastor to students and to younger Christians, I find that this is a pretty typical experience, that one of the most bitter experiences of the Old Testament as we read it today, almost verging on the unfair and the absurd, is the fact that when Moses comes to the end of his life, God does not allow him to enter into the promised land. And Moses himself, at the end of his life, experiences God's anger. That is said several times, that God was angry with Moses because of something Moses had done earlier. Other times, he was angry with Moses because of his anger with the people of Israel. However you understand that Moses experiences the end of his life with profound bitterness, as a crisis, as disappointment, and he doesn't get to go into the promised land. And as we read Psalm 90 in light of our crisis, I think we are meant to hear it and even to imagine in kind of a creative way that this is the kind of prayer Moses prayed when he was up on Mount Sinai and it looked like the story was over for the people of God. It looked like God's anger and judgment were going to have the last word, and that the story was going to come to an end in tragedy for the people of God. It's the kind of prayer that Moses prayed when he was at the end of his life and bitterness could have had the last word. It could have subsumed everything else about his story when he was told, you're not going to enter into the promised land. And yet in both of those moments, the bitterness and the tragedy are not only not all that's there, but they're not the main thing that are there for Moses. And so Moses is kind of the great teacher, the great leader of the people of God for how we respond to crisis, because he had to do it in his own life in ways that are almost unimaginable for us. So as I read Psalm 90, you can even kind of see it down here already. There's a pretty clear threefold structure. The first two verses of Psalm 90, I'm just going to describe as focusing on God's time. The first half of the psalm really starts in verse 3, and it goes down to verse 11. And I'm going to describe this or summarize this first half of the psalm, which is a lament, which is filled with bitterness. It really emphasizes the tragic dimension of crisis as our time as human beings, as God's people, as it actually is. And in the latter half of the psalm, which moves away from lament to intercession and request, it actually responds to the circumstances of our time and how it is our time as it could be. And it ends with that note of hope. And so Robert Alter, the great Jewish scholar who actually just in the last year or two published a translation, a magisterial translation of the entire Old Testament from Hebrew into English, actually says in his commentary on Psalm 90 that the duality of God's time and humanity's time is the great theme of this psalm. And as we're going to see in the first half of this psalm, the relationship between God's time in verses 1 and 2, in our time, our broken time of crisis, of disaster, of sorrow, in verses 3 through 11, it is one of contrast, even conflict. That the sense of God's time being so different from ours, both in that it is creative and life-giving, but also unending, whereas our time is so short and so filled with death and sorrow that the awareness that God's time exists alongside our time actually puts a bad taste in your mouth at the end of the first half of the psalm. But in the second half of the psalm, God's time relates to our time in a new way, in a creative way. And to use the Apostle Paul's phrase in the New Testament, the big theme of the second half of the psalm in Psalm 90 is that God's time redeems our time. And so we're going to see, let me read this out loud, and then we'll just kind of walk through where the psalm is, and then we'll do some interaction. And we'll, again, feel free to be writing down your questions either on the Google Doc that is listed under the chat function, or just kind of write them down so you can hold on to them and bring them up when we're done in a few minutes. So let me read Psalm 90, a prayer of Moses, the man of God. O Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world. And both of the verbs there are actually verbs of birth, a father or a mother giving birth and bringing new life into the world, that God gave birth to the mountains and he formed the earth and the world the way a parent forms a child. It's an image of creativity, of life, of production. And from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. God's time has no beginning. God's time has no end. And that's, in a sense, you read those two verses and it sounds pretty positive, but it's the backdrop to the bitterness of our time in verses 3 through 11. But this God who brings forth new life, this God who is from everlasting to everlasting, also turns back human beings to dust. Pretty clear allusion to Genesis 3. And says to us, turn back, O children of Adam. Because 1,000 years in your sight, O God, are but as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. And I would imagine that some of you will recognize that that's quoted in 2 Peter in the New Testament. But notice here, it's actually a statement of frustration. That whereas for God, 1,000 years is just like a day, for us, our time is so much shorter and we run out of it very quickly. And there's this sense of, God's time is not like my time. I wish my time was more like God's time. But instead, what passes for God very quickly, and because he has so much time, for us ends up being the whole story for us, even though it's only a watch in the night for him. And again, I don't want to get too off track here, but I would imagine for some of you who are experiencing this season of crisis with frustration, with angst, that perhaps you've articulated it this way to yourself, perhaps not. But one of the really hard things about the prospect, not only of the last 2 months to some extent going down the drain, but the prospect that months, perhaps even years to come, might not be what we had hoped they would be. And this idea that we have so little time anyway. Later in Psalm 90, it will reference at best 70 or 80 years for most of us. And in a season like this, it feels we're losing the short time we have. And it's just slipping through our fingers like sands through the hourglass. And that's bitter, that's frustrating. We want our time to be full of life, but instead, it's not only going by quickly, but it's frustrating. And so you, God, sweep them, human beings, away as with a flood. An image of chaos, of crisis. They're like a dream, here for one moment, gone the next, like grass that sprouts up in the morning. In the morning, the grass flourishes and sprouts up, but by the evening time, it's already fading and withering. That's what our time is like as human beings. And then verse 7, which starts with for or because, verses 7 through 9 really give us the explanation theologically for why our lives are the way they are, why our time is characterized the way it is in verses 3 through 6. Because we are brought to an end by your anger, O God. By your wrath, we are dismayed. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins, in the light of your presence. For all of our days pass away under your wrath, all of them from birth to death. And we finally bring our years to an end, whether it's of old age, whether it's earlier, like a sigh, exhaling, but also in the sense of the breath going out of us, but also in the sense of frustration, also in the sense of bitterness. The years of our life are 70, maybe by reason of strength 80, and yet their pride, their glory. One commentator translates this word as their pageantry, that the most impressive thing about human beings turns out to be nothing but toil and trouble. Our days are soon gone, and we fly away. And that's not a reference to flying off to heaven. That's a reference to that you're dead, that your life is over. And the first half of Psalm 90 concludes with this summary question. And in the midst of this experience, in the midst of this bitterness, in the midst of this crisis, of noticing that our lives are both incredibly short and incredibly frustrating, and that dual aspect makes our time bitter to us, makes it filled with sorrow and brokenness, who among us ever really steps back and considers the fact that it's the power of God's anger and his wrath which is behind this state of affairs in the world? Whoever really steps back and fully accepts that this judgment over us of death and the curse of sin and everything not being the way it's supposed to be, that this is not an arbitrary fact of biology, this is not a random accident of history, this is the personal, relational judgment of our Creator over us for our turning away from him. Who really steps back in these crisis moments and has eyes to see? That's what these moments reveal. And if it just ended there in Psalm 90, this would be a pretty depressing psalm. I actually think not only is this not finally only a depressing psalm, I don't even think Psalm 90 is finally a lament psalm. Some lament psalms, they include hope, they include goodness, but the main note is actually bitterness and frustration. I think the main note of Psalm 90 is not bitterness, but actually hope. But again, to get there, we have to go through the bitterness. We have to go through the valley of the shadow of death. Can't go around the storm, can't run away from the storm, you can't evade it, you can't deny it's there. To get to the hope, you have to go through the first half of Psalm 90. And again, I'll talk about this at the end in just a few minutes. I think for most of us, it's the full acceptance of verses 3 through 11, summed up by this question in verse 11, which of us really wrestles with, which of us really accepts that God's anger and wrath hangs in judgment over every aspect of our lives, over every moment of time we will ever experience? That's just too damn depressing. We want our lives to be something else than that. We want our dreams to be from birth to life, to be the Hollywood story. We want all the desires of our hearts to be satisfied in this world. And Psalm 90 exposes that as an illusion. Before I read the second half of the psalm, I'll just mention this. This might be some reading you pursue in the near future. I've been pondering over two old essays by C.S. Lewis in this season. One is called On Living in an Atomic Age, where he talks about just this new experience in the late 1940s of being aware that human beings now possess enough firepower to destroy life on Earth. And then another one called Learning in Wartime. And in both of these essays, the main point Lewis makes is that in seasons of crisis, our default instinctual reaction tends to be, oh, this is abnormal. Let's get back to normal as soon as we can. And even that language that pervades our culture right now, whether in the media, whether in our lives, whether in our conversations, I can't wait to get back to normal. And C.S. Lewis makes the point in both of these essays that the fact that death hangs over us, the fact that our lives are fragile, that they're never what they're supposed to be, that there's always bitterness in them, that they always fail to live up to our expectations of reality, that's always true all the time in every moment of human history. And Psalm 90, I think, agrees with that perspective, that a season of crisis doesn't introduce the dynamic of verse 3 through 11. Verses 3 through 11 are true of the world and of our time in it. Every moment of every situation we will ever take a breath. What's new in a season of crisis is that we are forced to deal with that. We are forced to actually look at that, and we cannot run away from it, at least not as easily as we usually do. And again, it's the acceptance of that that often is the hardest thing for us. And so Psalm 90 goes on, and you can almost, again, with that image of sighing, of exhaling at the end of the first half, you can kind of think that there's a pause here. You take a deep breath after verse 11, and now that's our circumstances. Whether we've accepted them or not is one thing, but now we're going to respond. Now Moses is going to teach us how you engage crisis, how you push back on, redirect your focus, aspire to new possibilities and directions. What do we do with the time that's left after the world has broken our heart? And the first, and I think the summary request in verse 12 is this. So God, in light of that, in light of verses 3 through 11, would you teach us to number our days? And there's a bit of an irony here, because that doesn't mean like God, help us to know ahead of time how many days we have, because we already know that. We got 70 or 80 years. That's about what we have, best case scenario. So teach us to number our days here is not so much like literally number them, as much as relate rightly to the time you have as it's characterized in verses 3 through 11. Your time is short and it is filled with crisis and heartbreak. Over all of it, God's judgment stands. His, as Karl Barth would say, God's no stands over every aspect of our existence in a fallen world. And help us to reckon with that. Help us to number our days so that we may get a heart of wisdom. And I think the 5 requests in the verses that follow, verses 13 through 17, are basically what a heart of wisdom looks like. Verses 13 through 17 constitute a wise response to crisis. They constitute a wise, insightful reaction to the world falling apart around us, or maybe even better, being revealed in a season like this for what it actually always is, which is full of toil and trouble and very, very short. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes kind of working through these requests, but let me read them out loud. The first is this: turn back, O Lord. How much longer? Have pity, compassion on your servants. That's actually the verb there, pity, that's often connected to God changing his mind in the Old Testament. God, turn away from showing anger and judgment. Change your mind. How much longer will this be our experience? Instead, like you did with Moses in Exodus 32 to 34, like you did with Moses at the end of his life, turn towards us in compassion, in love, and mercy. Let that be our experience rather than your judgment. Verse 14, satisfy us in the morning with your steadfast love, that we may rejoice and be glad all our days. I would imagine that for many of us, this verse sounds really great. I would imagine if you've read Psalm 90 before and prayed it, that this is a great prayer that you love praying, and I think it should be. But let me just make a suggestion that while it might ultimately include what I suspect we all hear in verse 14, which is, God, every morning I wake up, let me have kind of warm, fuzzy feelings in my heart. I don't think that kind of subjective approach to verse 14 is the main approach. And one of the reasons I think that is with the background of Moses in Psalm 90, the 2 words that are here in verse 14, satisfy us in the morning, are the 2 words that dominate the manna scene in Exodus 16, that every morning God poured out enough manna, even in the wilderness, even in crisis, every morning enough was given to satisfy their needs. And so I actually think a better parallel to verse 14, rather than every morning, God, let me wake up just feeling bright and happy and feeling a warm, fuzzy feeling in my heart, is more, give us this day our daily bread. Would you give us enough? Would our basic needs as creatures, as human beings, be satisfied? Would you help us to not go through our lives experiencing poverty, hunger, just a basic lack of what human beings need? Certainly, as we experience God's provision, like he gave in the manna in Exodus 16, like the daily bread in the Lord's Prayer, certainly a deep sense of God's covenant faithfulness, his steadfast love should be our experience. But I think the focus here is on God, even in seasons of crisis, give us what we need. Let us not have to kind of go to bed every night hungry with a roof not over our head. And again, just lots of applications here in a season where many of us perhaps experience the loss of jobs or the loss of health or not knowing if we're going to have enough food on our table a month from now. God, satisfy us every morning with tangible signs of your steadfast love and faithfulness so that we would be able to rejoice and be glad all our days, which again is a reminder that human beings are resilient, but we're also fragile. We're also vulnerable. We have basic needs that have to be met or none of us can thrive. God, like you did in the wilderness, satisfy us every day with your provision in the morning. Verse 15, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us. And that's a reference to the first half, affliction, God's affliction, and for as many years as we have seen evil. I love the combination of optimism and resilience in the prayer request of verse 15, but also just its incredibly pragmatic realism that if I was going to restate 15, I would say, God, just let us break even. When we get to the end of our 70 or 80 years, would there be as much joy as there was sorrow? Would there be as much love as there was loneliness? Would there be as much gladness as there was depression? This is not a prayer. And again, I should have said this earlier. Here's a way to think about it. there is a sense in which the second half of Psalm 90 is praying for the opposite of the first half of Psalm 90. And we'll see in a second that there are many parallels, that almost every prayer request in verses 12 through 17 is echoing a disaster from verses 3 through 11. And yet I think this needs to be said. Even if everything is granted in verses 12 through 17, none of it nullifies verses 3 through 11. None of it changes the fact that we live in this world under God's judgment, that death will have the final word on our worldly existence, that toil and trouble will mark out all of our days to some extent or another. The second half of Psalm 90 is not, God, let that not be true, overcome that, like deny that. It's rather saying, God, along with verses 3 through 11, would you let this also be true? So that being sorrowful, we would also be always rejoicing. So that even as we experience the judgment of suffering and death, we would also experience your steadfast love at the same time in this fallen world. For those of you who maybe know this phrase from kind of New Testament theology, there's a sense in which Psalm 90 emphasizes both the already and the not yet of the Christian life, and it insists that both of them are there. There is a not yet. We still live under the judgment of death. We still are frustrated with bitterness all the time in crisis. But there is also already all of this mercy, God's presence, God's provision, God's purposes. And in verse 15, make us glad for as many days as you have afflicted us, for as many days we have seen evil. God, we just want to break even. For all the bitterness, let there also be goodness. A great parallel to verse 15. And for those of you who know me well, you've probably heard me mention this many times over the years. It's been one of the probably most recurringly frequent prayers I pray in my own life, along with verse 15 here, which is in Joel 2, verse 25, one of the minor prophets, in the midst of years, perhaps a whole generation in the history of God's people, when locust plagues have devoured their economy, have shut down their lives, and have basically turned their experience of the world into just survival mode and just crisis all the time. There is a promise in Joel 2:25 that I will restore to you the years that the locusts have devoured. And I think that's the prayer of verse 15. God, for all the crappiness of a season like this, would there be seasons to come that make up for this? Would there be seasons to come filled with as much energy and community and productivity as this season is filled with loneliness and suffering and loss and perhaps famine in some ways? We just want to break even and taste your goodness alongside of the judgment that is invariably our fate as fallen human beings. Then verses 16 and 17, two distinct prayer requests to end with, but they're related to each other by the word work. Verse 16 is focused on God's work, verse 17 on our work. Verse 16 says, let your work, O God, be shown to your servants, and your glorious power to their children. Here's how I'm going to restate this, paraphrase it in my words. God, as we walk through this season of crisis, would you give us eyes to see, to have the faith to discern where you're at work, what you're doing, how you're bringing good out of evil, and to have eyes to see that, to not just see your judgment, to not just be aware of your hiddenness and the fact that you've turned away from us in judgment, but to also be aware that along with this profound no that you have spoken over our lives, that you are in the midst of speaking a yes over our lives. And help us to hear the echoes of that yes even now. Help us to see the outlines of what's going on right now where you're involved, to intervene, to redeem, to restore. Give us eyes to see that. The psalmist here knows God has not abandoned us. He has not turned away from us for good, that even now he is at work. And even before we can see the tapestry at the end that you are creating, help us to see the threads that you're weaving even now. And in verse 17, and let the splendor of the Lord be upon us. Some translations say the favor of the Lord, some the grace of the Lord, but it's actually almost certainly a mistake. The word here that literally is translated splendor or beauty or honor It's not an ethical word. It's not a moral word. It's an aesthetic word. And I'm going to mention one other place that shows up in the Psalms that I think are illuminating of it in a second. Let the splendor of the Lord be upon us, even insofar as the judgment of God is also upon us, and establish the work of our hands upon us. Yes, establish the work of our hands. And you can hear it as repeated emphasis. That's kind of the ultimate prayer request there. And let me mention two things here as I end. I'll wrap up with just some other notes here, which you'll have access to later, and then we'll jump into some Q&A. The first is this, that I think the reference to the splendor of the Lord there, combined with establishing the work of our hands, is actually an allusion back to a very early psalm in the Psalter, but also a really famous psalm. Psalm 8, some of you will remember this, is a poetic meditation, even celebration of basically Genesis 1, the incredibly dignified, glorious role that God has given human beings who bear his image in the world to play in creation. And in Psalm 8, verses 5 and 6, we are told that God has crowned us with glory and splendor or honor. That's the verb here in Hebrew in verse 17. And he has placed everything under our feet and given us dominion over the work of his hands. That is, that what we do, what we spend our time working on is supposed to be infinitely cosmically important because we're made in the image of God. And I would imagine that for those of you who know deeply who you are and what it means to reflect God's image and what your gifts are, that part of the frustration and perhaps ultimately the deepest part of our frustration in seasons of crisis and disruption is the idea that our efforts, our work, what we set our hands to is coming to nothing. That what we do now is making no impact on the world and is absolutely futile, in vain, and wasted. And Psalms 90, verse 17 ends with God, let us see what you're doing so that verse 17, we can begin participating in it with our work even now, because our great desire is that even though our stories will all end with death, our time is still our time that begins with birth and ends in death in this life. God's time started before us. There was a story at work in the world long before any of us were born, and God's time endures to everlasting after us, and the story goes on after us. God, in the 70 or 80 years we have, I want what I do now to play a part in the bigger story that is still to come. I don't want my efforts, my work, the time that I can spend to just go down the drain and be lost in the avalanche of history. I want it to matter. I want it to endure, establish the work of our hands. And so here as I end, I just want you to hear these 5 prayer requests as one word verbs. Verse 13, turn. Verse 14, satisfy. Verse 15, gladden. Verse 16, show. Verse 17, establish. Turn, satisfy, gladden, show, establish. If you understand Psalm 90, that's where we focus our energy. That's what we pour our minds, our hearts, our bodies into, individually and together as the people of God. We plead for God to turn away from judgment and instead to show mercy. And for this season to end, we actually intercede for God to change his mind. We ask him to provide for our basic needs and satisfy us every morning, to give us our daily bread. We ask him to let joy along with sorrow be our experience even now. We ask him to give us eyes to see how he's turning the situation around for good. And finally, we seek to participate in that in a way that matters and in a way that lasts. And so this will be available to you later. But here are some of the parallels between the first half of Psalm 90 and the second half of Psalm 90. The word morning, every morning. First half of Psalm 90, it's a reminder that like grass, we're here for a moment and then we're gone. But in the second half, satisfy us every morning. The years of our life, first half filled with bitterness, would you restore to us, second half, as many years of seeing evil with just as many years that see good. All our days, power, turn, return. He turns us back to dust, death. In the first half, we plead with God to turn back to us in mercy rather than away from us in judgment. In the second half, in children is a reminder in verse 3 that we are children of Adam, all fated to die. And in verse 16, children become the ultimate reminder that the story still goes on even after our 70 or 80 years are over. And so again, the second half of Psalm 90, it doesn't pray for so much the reversal of the first half, because the first half is always true in seasons of crisis, but ultimately always, but for this to also be true in the second half, along with the first half. And again, it's possible because of God's time. Let me end with this. These are, I'm not going to work through this at all right now. Here are a number just listed of echoes and connections between Exodus 32 to 34, Deuteronomy 31 to 34 with Psalm 90, that again, if you open these up and really pore over them, I think they'll make Psalm 90 come alive in your imagination, and to be able to hear it and to connect it to our crisis today and to all the crises still to come in our lives in the future in a deeper way. And then I was going to do this more, maybe during Q&A here, we can do it a bit more, but I've been reading a lot of Dietrich Bonhoeffer in this season from the last 2 years of his life when he was in prison in Nazi Germany during World War II, as a Lutheran pastor who ran an illegal underground seminary, ultimately participated in the plot against Hitler and was caught along with all the other conspirators, thrown in jail, first a prison in Tegel, finally a concentration camp, last 2 years of his life in prison, and then is finally hanged. And in these hundreds of letters that he writes to friends, to family, even just poems and meditations he writes to God, there is a constant wrestling with the realities of Psalm 90, disappointment along with opportunity, tragedy along with joy. And so much of it, again, you'll have access to these, so much of what Bonhoeffer works through in this season is profoundly reminiscent of Psalm 90. And in fact, I'm gonna just end with this and then we'll do Q&A. There are two things that I want you to especially pay attention to if you have time to read this material on Bonhoeffer later. One is that he actually writes in the final months of his life, it's here on the page, it goes on for many more pages, so we're not going to read it now. He writes a long poem that's in 5 parts that he calls The Death of Moses, in which he's reflecting on this death sentence that God hands to Moses, that you're not going to enter the promised land in Deuteronomy 31 to 34. And as Bonhoeffer scholars have realized for a long time, Bonhoeffer, like Psalm 90 is trying to do for us, is very much redrafting his own experience of disappointment. Bonhoeffer, for many years, hoped that when Hitler and the Third Reich were finally defeated, that he would be able to spend years and decades helping to rebuild Germany, helping to restore the church after years of faithlessness in the church. And he realizes, I'm not going to get to go into the promised land. And so he, as an incredibly important leader in the Lutheran church and the German church during these years, he very much kind of tells his own story through the lens of Moses' story. And I think he's just doing what Psalm 90 offers all of us here. And the last thing I want to do with Bonhoeffer is read this last quote here, starting with "by the way." He writes this to his best friend Eberhard in the final kind of year or so of his life. And he says, "By the way, I notice more and more how much I'm thinking and perceiving things in line with the Old Testament. Thus, in recent months, I have been reading much more the Old than the New Testament. Only when one loves life and the earth so much that with it everything seems to be lost, and at its end may one believe in the resurrection of the dead and a new world. Whoever wishes to be and to perceive things too quickly and too directly in the New Testament," and some of you maybe noticed that I haven't said anything about resurrection from the dead tonight. I'm going to end with that, but you can only end with it. You can't start there. "Is to my mind no Christian," Bonhoeffer says. "One can and must not speak the ultimate word prior to the penultimate." And let me end with this thought. For many of us, the reason that resurrection from the dead, no matter how much we believe in our theology, doesn't play much role practically in our lives is because we try to go to it directly without having to wrestle with verses 3 through 11 in Psalm 90, that we're going to die. If I was going to sum up the first half of Psalm 90, it's this: like Moses, we all die before we get to the promised land. Every single one of us is going to run out of time. All of us are going to go to our grave with most of our desires unfilled, with most of our hopes not brought to fruition, and with most of what we wanted our experience of the world to be still unfulfilled. We all die before we get into the promised land. We all run out of time. But if there's this claim in this prayer at the end of Psalm 90, establish the work of our hands so that they would not be in vain, that's what the resurrection from the dead offers us in the long run. In 1 Corinthians 15, the longest discussion of it in Scripture, time and time again we are told our labor is not in vain when we set our hands to work and to participate in God's purposes in the world. We're not wasting our time because Christ has been raised from the dead. But just as Jesus had to go through the valley of death to get to resurrection, so do we. Verses 12 through 17, they're possible even here, even now, but not unless we accept, confront, and internalize the reality of verses 3 through 11. And so that question in verse 11, have we considered, have we accepted that this is the world we live in? And have we responded by asking for a heart of wisdom and reorienting ourselves to what is possible, even here, even now, before we get to the resurrection from the dead? So again, I'm going to give you all these materials here. Let me come back to the screen right now, and I'm sure that there have been lots of questions that have been written. If you need to run at any point, feel free. What I am going to do is grab some of these questions and begin recording to them. Okay, so the first one was, will the recording be sent out? Yes, it will. I will try to get this out here in the near future. Might be a day, might be a couple of days, but I will send it out to my email list. If you're not on my email list, just shoot me an email, just my name, nick.nowalk@gmail.com. I'll just put it right here. If you want to get on my list for when I send out opportunities like this, just let me know. The second question is, can you please name the two C.S. Lewis essays again? And one is on living in an atomic age, and the other is learning in wartime. And those are both C.S. Lewis. One of them, Learning in Wartime, I believe is available online as to be read for free online as a PDF. The other one, Living in Atomic Age, can't be read online, but in case you don't have the book of essays it comes from, or don't want to pick up a copy of it, if you go to YouTube and you search, there's actually somebody who's reading it out loud on YouTube, and you can actually listen to it on YouTube. So both of them can be accessed online. Okay, question number 3, on daily manna and basic needs. In-person church gatherings are technically inessential right now, even though we're not disembodied souls. I'm worried that we, as a society, have deemed some of our embodied spiritual practices as inessential. What are some daily, essential spiritual manna needs practices that we can pursue each morning while physically distancing? And this is a great question. Almost every time I've spoken to groups in the last month or so, a form of this question comes up. And so my main instinct right now is twofold. And in some ways, I suppose it tracks the logic and the structure of Psalm 90. Let me give you the bad news first, and then the good news. The bad news is this: there is no denying that this is a season of crisis, and that there are things that are not available to us experientially until we're able to move out of this crisis and to actually gather back together, to actually go back to work. Whether you're working from home and just the challenges mentally and physically of being inside all day, or whether you've even lost your job, or perhaps we will lose our jobs in the months to come because of this, at some point we need to experience God's turning around in the second half of Psalm 90. And none of us know how long that will be. None of us know exactly what that will look like, but we can pray, we can hope that what we're experiencing right now will not be all we experience for the rest of our lives. And we can plead with God to turn back. And so on the one hand, I would say, let's not minimize that this is a season of loss, that this is a season of lamenting, not being able to gather together, at least in big groups, not being able to explore outside and be with one another outside and to go to work and all these things. Let's not skip over lament. And I would say, when you become aware of these experiences of deprivation, of bitterness, of lack, among other things, actually enter into lament. Don't try to evade it right away. Don't try to say, oh, here's how I can still have it now. And therefore, kind of implicitly say there's actually no crisis in this season. This is a season where harsh limits are placed on all of us. And so let's enter into that, accept it, lament it, and process it. But the second thing I would say is let's look and dream together as the people of God for creative ways. And again, maybe to go to those last two prayer requests in verse 16 and 17, God, would you show us what you are making available to us even now? And would you help our activity, our time, our efforts to be coordinated with the work you're already doing? For some of us, that might mean being more and more creative and continuing to be proactive with Sunday morning gatherings and small groups over Zoom, and fighting against Zoom fatigue and fighting against not actually feeling connected. For some people, it might be picking up the phone or even just getting outside and walking around. For others, it's going to be, use this time for things that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to use it to: reading, projects, checking in on one another, deepening your prayer life, digging deeper into scripture. Do what you can, but also acknowledge the limits that are there. And again, central to our prayer, and even starting it in the second half of Psalm 90, is God, turn. How much longer? And until this is over, there really are profound limits on us individually and as a society. Number 4, this is a great one, and I think it always comes up on these kinds of passages, like in Psalm 90. How do we reconcile Jesus's death and resurrection with this focus on God's anger, God's wrath, and God's judgment? And I love this question. I think this is a really important question for us biblically and theologically. And then if I had more time, I was actually going to go to this direction anyway, so I'm glad to be able to kind of focus on this for a second. In general, again, kind of going back all the way to the beginning, when I framed it as, let's be both and rather than either or, rather than saying verses 3 through 11, that's the whole story. Kind of like Job in Job 14. You know what it means to be a human being? It's to be few of days and full of trouble, because God always stands over us in anger and judgment. That is true, but it's not the only thing that's true. It's not the main thing that's true. And when we experience God's goodness and God's love, that is true, but it never takes us out of this present evil age. It never means that suffering and death and heartbreak are not also always part of our story too. And we need to hold on to both. And on this both and, with respect to, because of Jesus, God has spoken through Jesus's life, his sinless, perfect life, his sacrificial death, his victorious resurrection, that the definitive word from God is yes and not no. But he also speaks no before he speaks yes, and he speaks no so that he would speak yes. And if we're called to participate in Jesus's resurrection, we're also called, even now, on the other side of being Christians, who are forgiven and no longer under God's wrath, to participate in his death. And so I would say this: some Christians respond to seasons like this by really emphasizing God isn't judgmental like he was in the Old Testament. God's wrath, God's judgment, God's anger, that's not a thing anymore, or at the very least, it's not a thing for Christians anymore. And sometimes this is rightly motivated by what it's responding to. There's just a refusal to associate God with any of the hard parts of life, as being behind or in any of the bitterness, any of the suffering. And I would imagine that if you have ever spent much time reading the Bible, that one of the most jarring aspects of the Bible, both Old Testament and New Testament, is how unembarrassingly and directly and relentlessly the biblical writers say this happened because God. This happened, bad stuff, because God. This happened because of God's judgment, and even for the people of God. And God's judgment is not in every sense turned away because of Jesus' death and resurrection. And maybe the most obvious way we see that is if Jesus died in our place, and that's the whole story, so that God is no longer judgmental, no longer angry, no longer filled with wrath towards this world, why do we still die? Like, why don't we just go straight to eternal life now? Why do we still suffer even when we don't sin? Like, we still experience the effects of God's judgment and God's anger every day. On the other hand, maybe again, just to be stereotypical, conservative, more fundamentalist Christians, whatever language you want to use, often are, in my mind, way too ambitious and way too, I would just say, unbiblical. And whenever a season like this comes, just assuming that we know for sure not only it is God's judgment, but we know what it is he's judging, who it is who did what's wrong, and what needs to change. And I don't mean it all to be too crass here, but some Christian interpretations of the COVID-19 season, God almost sounds like the ultimate Donald Trump. I'm sending this to make America great again. And I just think that's largely a mistake. The language of anger and wrath and judgment in Psalm 90 is a reference to God's overall stance towards the world as it is and continues to be in rebellion against him. And all of us continue to participate in that rebellion, that sin, that iniquity in real ways. That doesn't mean that God is angry at us in the sense that perhaps we think like God is constantly losing his temper at us, but it does mean that even as Christians, when we suffer, when we go through crisis, when the world falls apart, we are to trace that back to this is because of God's displeasure. This is because of God's judgment, righteously, rightly, over us as those who have turned away from him in Adam. That's not the only thing that's true of us as Christians. That is not the main thing that's true of us as Christians. But God's no continues to be part of our experience alongside of his yes. And maybe this is the best way for me to move on from this question, although feel free to keep following up with it. Karl Barth, I think, understood this dynamic very well. Maybe the most famous Christian theologian in the world in the 20th century, when it's not just that God says no and yes to us in Jesus, but that he says no to us in order that he might say yes to us. God's judgment is restorative in intent. God hurts us in order to heal us. He judges us in order to redeem us. He brings crisis so that we might wake up and return to him, which means that even in verses 3 through 11, God's ultimate attitude, or let's say intention behind that, is so that we might walk into, engage with, embody, and participate in the new way of being human in verses 12 through 17. And so, yes, the first and last word of the gospel, the main emphasis is that we are under God's grace, but that doesn't mean that we don't still walk in the fear of the Lord and discern that. I have no idea, to be honest, why COVID-19 has happened right now from God's perspective. I'm very agnostic when I hear Christians, when Christians are very confident that it's because of this, almost always what I hear there is you're writing your ideology onto the heavens. And you're basically saying God rules history to vindicate my political ideology. God rules history to show that Republicans and not Democrats are right, or Democrats and not Republicans are right, or that this is the issue and not that the issue. And the reality is that there is plenty for God to judge all the time. What we do know, and we see this in Luke 13 with Jesus, is we have no idea time and time again why towers fall on people, why empires spill the blood of God's people. But we do know that unless we repent, we also will perish. And that this always comes to us as, among other things, a reminder that we live in a world that has a death sentence over it, and that the road to life leads through that death, and that the road to redemption leads through the crisis. And again, what I worry about with most of us in our culture, just in general, but especially Christians, is that we want verses 12 through 17 without having to go through verses 3 through 11. And for the rest of our lives, every day, verses 3 through 11 will be true of our experience. The question is whether we have eyes to see that, and whether we're willing to accept it and to see that that happens so that we might wake up and enter into verses 12 through 17. I'm sure there's a lot more I could say on that and should say on that, but those are a couple of the thoughts. Last two questions. How do we lament while not falling into despair? This is a great question. On lament, if you want to pursue this more, a great place to start is a book by Glenn Pemberton called Hurting with God, Learning to Lament with the Psalms. There are many good works on lament, and one of the things I'm encouraged about in the body of Christ in general, at least in our cultural context, in the last few years, last decade or two, is a growing awareness that lament is not only all over the Bible, but we just don't do it. We sing happy songs on Sunday, and then more happy songs, and then more happy songs. And we just hit a one-note emphasis that's not only unbiblical, but profoundly untrue to the complexity of our lives. And learning to lament is an incredibly important skill. For now, I'll say this: lament is neither complaining and whining, nor is it despairing, to use this language. Lament is the articulation to ourselves, but especially to God, of how much we're hurting, but with the hope, with the confidence that God can and will do something about it as we trust him and follow Jesus. And so lament is ultimately an act of hope and not an act of despair. But again, to use Psalm 90 as our paradigm, it's the hope of lament walks through verses 3 through 11 before we can fully taste verses 12 through 17. And so lament is about articulating, naming, owning, and embracing our pain, but then bringing it to God and saying, how much longer, God? When are you going to fulfill your promises? When are you going to set right what's gone wrong in my life, in our lives, in the world? And it insists upon God being faithful to what he's promised. And so lament is an act of faith, an act of hope, and an act of love. But it does require that we feel, that we articulate, that we enter into the pain of our experience. And in our cultural context, we are not good at that in general. We run from, we evade, we try to move as quickly as we can through the crisis, the suffering, and the pain. Number 6, final question. To follow up on the last point, what are ways that we can practically live in the hope of the resurrection in the day-to-day by walking through the despair, death? That's super wordy, but I hope it makes sense. You might have just answered it, but feel free to add anything else. Yeah, that's a great question. Let me just give one immediate kind of real practical suggestion, which is, especially in a season like this, but just in general on a regular basis, read and pray Psalm 90 a lot. If somebody picks up your Bible when you set it down 5 years from now, I hope book 3 and book 4 of the Psalms are really well worn. Don't cherry pick. Don't relentlessly jump to the happy Psalms. Don't relentlessly avoid the sad Psalms. Also, either because if your circumstances objectively are overwhelming for a long time, or because, or like me, if you're really angsty and prone to be, introspective and darker anyway, is I would say the opposite. Don't sit in the dark Psalms all the time. Move to the Psalms of celebration. To kind of mention somebody that I was hoping I would mention more tonight practically, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a small book on the Psalms earlier in his life, and one of the most practical and insightful things he says is you should not only pray the Psalms and not just read them. Don't primarily read them to get theology. Pray them. Talk to God with them. Engage them. Participate in the Psalms. But he says you should pray them in order. Start in Psalm 1, work through Psalm 150 and then start again, because you will force yourself to have to enter into and articulate the fullness of your experience as a human being, and not cherry pick the parts you like more or that you're more prone to identify with. And for some of us, to use Paul's language in the New Testament, for some of us, we really need to be able to grow. And a season like this is an opportunity to be able to weep with those who weep. And for some of you, whenever you see weeping out there in the world, you panic and you run away. And some of us, and I would include myself here, we need to learn and to grow into being able to rejoice with those who rejoice. We feel the darkness of the world. We feel the hopelessness, the depression of it. We feel the brokenness of it, but it's hard to also celebrate too. It's also hard to laugh and to have fun and to connect and to love. And in a healthy human being following Jesus is someone who can both rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And so that's the last thing I'll say here on this, which is not only in your own life, weep your tears, laugh your joy, actually engage your emotions in your experience in both directions. But I would also say, as Christians, when you notice other people around you who are weeping, this is a really countercultural thing. Actually enter into it. It's one thing to enter into your own sorrow. That's hard enough sometimes. When you see someone else who's sorrowful, actually choose to enter into it and to feel some of what they're feeling as an act of solidarity, as an act of companionship, as an act of friendship and support. And when you see someone else rejoicing, you might not be rejoicing very much in that moment or that day or that season, and yet choose to walk towards that other person's joy and rejoice with them. I think rejoicing with those who rejoice and weeping with those who weep, along with just being committed to cry our own tears and grief and to laugh and to celebrate our own joy, are things we need to be intentional about, and that none of us move towards naturally, at least not in a full, healthy way. I think that is an incredibly important thing for us to do. Again, Psalm 90 is there. Pray it a lot. Get to know it a lot. The Psalms in general. Maybe read Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Letters and Papers in Prison. But regularly name, articulate, enter into both verses 3 through 11 of Psalm 90 and verses 12 through 17. They're both there every moment of every day in the history of the world. The no of God, the yes of God. The sorrow of the world, the joy of the world. A season of crisis is, on the one hand, a tragedy because it brings to the surface so unmistakably and so undeniably what verses 3 through 11 are always saying, but can be ignored and missed. But it's also an opportunity to grow into verses 12 through 17, because a season like this probably exposes for many of us that our joys were trivial and shallow and not based on God and our neighbor and the fullness of who he's created us to be. And so even our joys have an opportunity to be refined and redirected in some life-giving ways. And again, I'm going to end with this, and then if anybody wants to actually ask questions out loud, or if you want to lead, whatever you want to do, but I'll pray us out officially. I'm happy to stick around. Let me answer that question of how do we do this resurrection thing every day, along with the lament and death thing, by saying this. And this is where I think connecting 1 Corinthians 15, resurrection, our labor is not in vain, to the more this worldly Old Testament focus of Psalm 90 is helpful, which is, I've often thought about it like this. Some of us will experience our 70 or 80 years as being more front-loaded towards verses 12 through 17. And when we look back on the years and decades of our lives, if we have eyes to see, we'll all be able to say, yeah, verses 3 through 11, I experienced this in some real ways. Like I lost a loved one there, or lost my job here. You know, my marriage was much harder than I thought it was going to be, or this physical breakdown and chronic physical condition happened. But by and large, the days and the weeks and the months and the years and the decades of my life, I was just so thankful that I just really felt verses 12 through 17 far more often than I didn't. And within the 70 or 80 years of your life, the already will break through in a more pronounced way than it will with some other people. And if the story of Job in the Old Testament and the story of Jesus in the New Testament teaches us anything, never ever take that as a sign that you've been more obedient than other Christians. That's grace. On the other hand, some of you, some of us will experience our 70 or 80 years as being lopsidedly prone towards 3 through 11. That felt like the norm far more often than not. In the echoes of verses 12 through 17, they were faint, they were infrequent, and they surprised us, and they didn't last very long. And especially to those of us who might be in that second category, whether right now, in a prolonged season of months or years, or just overall in our lives, I would say this. Here's what focusing on our time in Psalm 90, between God's time, which comes before it, and God's time, which comes after it, is helpful for. If our lives, if our story really is, we're born, we live, and we die, and those are the horizons, then if verses 3 through 11 are lopsided in your life, and tragedy is more pronounced than joy, and sorrow is more pronounced than community and love and happiness, then it is true that if you're only evaluating your 70 or 80 years in terms of between birth and death, then it's true a lot of Christians go to their grave and it's difficult to see anything else but their lives were tragedies. The tragic dimension profoundly kind of outweighed the comic dimension. But it's also true that if our time in this world is not only not the whole story, but is a little chapter in a much bigger story, then all of a sudden it becomes possible for the major note of my life in this world to actually be tragic, to actually be more verses 3 through 11 than verses 12 through 17, and yet for me to understand and experience my life overall as still a comedy and not a tragedy. And that's what the resurrection from the dead does. The story started before I came on the scene. It will continue after I'm off the scene, and I will participate in what is coming later on. And I think that's why among non-Christians, verses 12 through 17 can actually be experienced more, and yet their lives really feel bitter when they come to the end. And why for Christians, verses 3 through 11 can be loud and obnoxiously lopsided, and yet a joy that resounds throughout it all can still actually be the major note of our lives. As Rudolf Bultmann said about the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians, for Christians who know the hope of the gospel, suffering doesn't stop. Experience of God's judgment and anger don't stop, but suffering loses its desperate character in our lives. And the second half of Psalm 90 is why we still suffer, but suffering loses its desperate character. And again, I would imagine for some of us, not only is this a season of crisis and suffering, but sometimes it can feel like not only is it suffering, but it's the desperateness of the suffering that is especially hard to cope with. And that's where let's move through verses 3 through 11 into verses 12 through 17. Let me pray to close us out. If you want to leave, you can. If you want to just take yourself off mute and ask a question now, you're more than welcome to. I am so glad you were all here tonight. I would love to hear. Shoot me an email, shoot me a text, write it in a message here, whatever you want. Would it be helpful to do reflections on Psalms like this every once in a while in this season? Would you be interested in that? Whatever your answer to that is, I'm so glad you were here tonight. And let me pray for us to close out. Father, we are thankful that you are the God who is our dwelling place, that even when, like Moses, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, like so many of your people throughout history, we experience exile, homelessness, heartbreak, crisis, loss, that even in those seasons, you are home. That the God who is from everlasting to everlasting, who gave birth to the world and creation, and who brought us forth, that even though you turn us back to dust in your righteous, justified judgment over us as our holy, good, wise, and loving creator, thank you that your no is not only not the only thing you speak over our lives, that it's not the main thing you speak over our lives. And I pray for each one of us that you would help us to take seriously that even as Christians, there is a no that has been spoken over our existence and that cannot be overcome in this life, that cannot be turned away, that cannot be evaded, that we will all end our lives going back to the dust what we came from and noticing that not only are our days and our years ended by your judgment, but all of them pass away under your judgment and your anger. And I pray that you would give us eyes to see that and to fully accept and to embrace the limitations of what is possible in a fallen world. But I also pray, and I even more pray, that as we move through that you would help us to gain a heart of wisdom, to count our days rightly, and to notice that, yes, this quality of bitterness and crisis characterizes all of our days, but there was time before this, there will be time after this, and that the time that remains can be redeemed. And so we pray, turn back to us in grace, satisfy us every morning with your provision, gladden our hearts and fill us with joy that's commensurate with and equal to the suffering and the sorrow and the heartbreak. Show us the work of your hands and where you are active to redeem and to speak yes and to restore and to turn evil back towards good and establish the work of our hands so that we would use the time we have left to be focused on things that will endure, to participate in the larger story of your redemption of the world you love, and help us to experience all of that as those who have a heart of wisdom. We are thankful for your faithfulness, Father. We're thankful that on the other side of the death and resurrection of Jesus, we get to understand this so much more than Moses ever did, so much more than Israel in the Old Testament did. But we also confess that we are not as comfortable as we should be, not as adept as we should be at participating in the death of Jesus along with his resurrection, and help us to be a both and people rather than an either or people. I pray that your blessing would be upon each person. And again, we pray, help us to engage you in the fullness of who you are, in the fullness of what's going on in the world in this season of crisis. And we ask all that in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. So, like I said, feel free to take off. I'm happy to stick around for a few more minutes for anybody who's interested in just kind of, asking questions out loud. So if you want to, just take yourself off mute and throw a question on.
I'm going to hop off, Nick, but I really appreciated it. Thank you for putting it all together.
My pleasure.
Hey, regarding Moses, way back when, and contending with the sovereignty and the providence of God. And it says that Moses had God change his mind so he wouldn't destroy the Israelis.
Yep.
I wrestle with that, and that how does a mere man tainted with sin have the inkling, have the audacity to say that, God, I don't think you should do that. I think you should do this.
That's a great question.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Let me say two things. One is, I think I used this language earlier, that God's judgment is always, in his intention, restorative and rehabilitative, and not destructive. What I mean by that is every time God speaks a no to human sin, every time he says, if you do this, you will die, in telling us that, and even causing us to experience that, he never desires that judgment, that no, would be the final word, but rather, instead of there being a period after that judgment, there would be a comma so that we might wake up and hear his yes and enter into it. And I think the reason Moses and many other of God's people throughout history can confidently say, God, change your mind from this judgment, turn away from wrath and turn back to us for mercy, is not because they think they know better than God, not because they think they're more merciful than God and God has a short, hot temper, but because they know, God, your purposes are not finally to destroy, to abandon, to give up on us, but to redeem us. And so don't let this be the final word. The other thing is, and I'm going to read you a Bonhoeffer quote that I wanted to read earlier, and so this is a good time to do it, is I think that and I gave this seminar at some point in the last year or two down in Neighborhood Church. I know it's on YouTube if anybody wants to look it up, on the unchangeable God who changes his mind, is that it also flows out of this theme in Genesis 1 that's assumed and exposited throughout the rest of Scripture. But I think when we only or mainly emphasize the sovereignty of God, the power of God, which we should, that's absolutely there, and that is the main part of the story, we can kind of play down that God created humanity as his image bearers to cooperate with him as his covenant partners in establishing the kingdom in the world. And so in these moments when you see a Moses or whoever pleading with God to change his mind, here's what Bonhoeffer says in one of his letters from prison very early on. I believe that God can and will let good come out of everything, even the greatest evil. And again, he's saying that in the midst of the Holocaust. He's saying that in the midst of a really spectacularly, depressingly high percentage of the German church bowing down and compromising under the Third Reich. He's saying that knowing that he's in prison and that he might very well die and not. And Bonhoeffer, when Bonhoeffer was executed, he was a year and a half younger than I am now. 39 years old. This guy's life got cut out in the middle of what could have been and should have been years and decades of fruitful service, of brilliant creativity, of dynamic leadership. And he not only says, I believe that God can and will let good come out of everything, even the greatest evil, but for that to happen, and this language that Bonhoeffer uses here, it could be misunderstood and taken in the wrong way, for sure, very easily. But nonetheless, I think he's right. But for that to happen, God needs human beings who also participate with him in letting everything work out for the best. And so he says this, and I think this is such a great comment on the logic of Psalm 90, especially verses 12 through 17. Bonhoeffer says, I believe that God is no timeless fate, but rather waits for and responds to the sincere prayer and the responsible actions of his people. And that's the logic of verses 12 and following. Turn, O God, establish the work of our hands along with the work that you are up to. God is looking for people to participate in what he's doing. And again, what Moses knows more than anything else is deep down at the bottom of the heart of God is a desire for life and not death, desire for restoration and not condemnation. John 3 in the Gospel of John, the Son of God came into the world not to condemn it, but that it might be saved through him. Moses knows no matter what's going on in the moment, no matter how lopsided our experience is towards judgment, this is not God's intention. This is not the final word. And let's be a part of seeing the story turn back around. There's certainly a lot of mystery on this theme, but a deep commitment to God always speaks no, only so that he would finally say yes, and he wants us to participate in that work in the world. I think that's behind Moses' confidence. That doesn't mean that sometimes you don't hear no from God. Moses heard yes in Exodus 32 to 34. He also heard no at the end of his life in Deuteronomy 34. Nope, you're not going to the promised land. And so, but nonetheless, he is always willing to venture that God's yes is underneath and behind and on the other side of his no. His love is always the purpose of his judgment. His mercy is always the ultimate purpose, even of his wrath. As Paul says at the end of Romans 11, he has consigned everyone under judgment in order that he might have mercy on everyone.
Oh, boy.
Yeah, but it's a great question. Other thoughts, other questions for those of you who are still around? Let's see. Having a tough time in my lack of technological savvy seeing if any more questions have been posted in the chat. I don't think they have. I think it's just kind of people taking off. Any final questions? Just take mute off and let us know. All right, going once, going twice, going 3 times. So glad you all joined tonight. I'll let you know soon if there's more here. What's that, Helen? Okay, one more question is coming up. We'll end with this, coming up on my Google Doc. It seems cruel of God that Moses died without seeing the promised land. Why doesn't God give us happy earthly endings? Oh my goodness, I love this question. I just affirm, whenever I read Exodus through Deuteronomy, I feel frustrated that Moses didn't get to go into the promised land. Not just frustrated, it feels unfair. And I think there's a very real sense in which it is. I think there's a very real sense in which we should feel that when we read the story of Job. We should read that especially when we should feel that when we read the story of Jesus. And we should regularly feel that when we look at the lives of many of God's people. And again, starting from their birth, going to their death, just those 70 or 80 years, there are a lot of people who are faithful to God, where the major note of their lives is sorrow and not joy. And there are many people who live wicked, self-centered, awful, destructive lives, and yet the major note of their lives is joy and flourishing and not sorrow. This is certainly part of the logic, not all of it, but part of the logic of resurrection from the dead. It's not just a cherry on top at the end, it's theodicy. Let me put it this way. This might seem bold, even a bit outlandish, but I really think it's true. For all of us, if the story ended here at the end of 70 or 80 years, or even 20 years, 30 years, 39, like Bonhoeffer, if the story ended here, God would be unfaithful to his people. God's not going to be unfaithful to his people. That's why the story doesn't end here. But it is true that taken in isolation, not only are there the wicked who don't experience God's justice, there are the righteous who don't experience God's justice in a negative way, who suffer more than they should, who are not rewarded the way they should be. And a lot of that is, honestly, the mystery of the problem of evil that Job is wrestling with. And I don't think finally we're given definitive, specific answers, at least not why does it happen to me here rather than you there. But we are given enough to know that it's because of the fallenness of the world, because God is patient even with those who are wicked, because he desires none to perish, and that he's always bringing good out of evil. But I do think we should be able to name those moments as this isn't right when a Moses doesn't get to go into the promised land. This isn't right when a Jesus ends up on the cross. This isn't right when a Bonhoeffer is executed by Hitler while Hitler's sitting in his luxury palace. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And it's absolutely not. God will, this is one of the reasons in scripture why there's a resurrection, not only of the just, but also of the unjust. That this 70 or 80 years is not the whole story for anybody. We trust God in the long run to work it out. And then maybe for anyone who either in your own life is wrestling with this, why is sorrow so pronounced in my life compared to joy, or just, noticing that in another Christian's life or in other people's lives? I do think that one of the ways the story of Jesus gives us insight and paradigms that go beyond anything the old covenant people of God can understand is that it's actually through those experiences in the life of God's faithful people that he's often extending his grace into the world. And so, again, if Jesus's death is not for him, but for us, that means, to put it this way, and I'll end with this, that a lot of the suffering in our lives cannot be made sense of if we're looking for immediate in this life payoffs into our happiness. And for some of you, maybe that you've even been able to articulate that. Like my dreams got dashed there. That was frustrating and broken, but I really just trusted that that meant that 5 years later, I would see the payoff and that I would see the fullness of Romans 8:28 in my 70 or 80 years in my life. And I don't think God promises us that. I do think that he redeems all of our sorrow. And I think that part of the logic of the Moseses, of the Jobs, of the Jesuses, and for those of us who might also taste that to some degree, is that it's often the people of God who have experienced the most senseless suffering that God is preparing to be used most powerfully in the world. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Moses is basically the major character in the Old Testament, just as Jesus is in the New Testament, that they experienced a disproportionate amount of bitterness in their lives, and yet a disproportionate amount of grace went out from them to the world and to the people of God. And again, that's not a definitive answer, it's not a full answer, but I think having eyes to see the longer story, the bigger story, but also that God's grace doesn't just come to you, but also goes out from you to others. I think those are the kind of things we should be looking for. Okay, guys, thank you so much for the great questions, for everybody participating. So encouraging to have you all on tonight. And again, would love to hear follow-up topics, that Psalms that you would like to see addressed in this season. If you would be interested in having more of these happen, I would love to do that if people are interested. For now, good night, everybody. And I'm thankful to get to look at Psalm 90 with you tonight. Good night, everybody.